When my grandparents needed help, I was the only one there. But my cousins took all the credit and then, hi Reddit, I'm Jordan, and I guess you could say I've always been the quiet one in my family. You know the type, the one who doesn't stir the pot, who stays out of drama. That used to be fine by me, until recently. Now, I feel like I've been holding on to this secret for way too long, and I need to let it out. My grandparents, Evelyn and Walter, are the sweetest, most generous people I've ever known. I practically grew up in their house. Every summer, my parents would send me there while they worked long hours, and honestly, it was like a second home. Evelyn taught me how to bake her famous peach cobbler, and Walter taught me how to fix up old bikes in his garage. They've always been there for me, no matter what, and I owe them so much. But now they're getting older. Evelyn has arthritis in her knees, and Walter, well, Walter's memory isn't what it used to be. Some days he's sharp as a tack, but other days, he forgets things, like where he put his glasses or even what year it is. It's heartbreaking to see. Naturally, when they started needing more help, I was the one who stepped up. At first, it was just little things. Picking up their groceries, mowing the lawn, helping Walter with his crossword puzzles when he got frustrated. But over time, it's become more of a full-time responsibility. Evelyn had a fall last year, and since then, I've been driving her to all her doctor's appointments. Walter's blood pressure has been a roller coaster, so I make sure they're both eating healthy. I even help them install those grab bars in their bathroom. Here's the kicker, though. The rest of my family? They're pretty much MIA. My mom, Diane, tries to visit when she can, but she's busy with her own life. And my Uncle Roger and his family? Forget it. They live less than an hour away, but they hardly ever show up. When they do, it's usually just to take some pictures with my grandparents, post them on social media, and act like the perfect family. At first, I didn't mind. I mean, I'm not doing this for attention. I love Evelyn and Walter, and I want to be there for them. But lately, it's been getting under my skin. A few weeks ago, Roger and his wife Linda came over for dinner. I'd spent the whole day helping Evelyn cook, cleaning up the house, and making sure everything was perfect. They walked in, late as usual, with their kids Logan and Chloe in tow. Logan made a beeline for the fridge, grabbed a soda, and flopped on the couch like he owned the place. Chloe barely looked up from her phone the entire time. And then there was Roger. He strutted in with his usual smug smile and said something like, "So glad we could make it. You know, it's so important to spend time with family." I wanted to scream. The guy hadn't lifted a finger to help his parents in months, but here he was, acting like the dutiful son. Dinner was the usual awkward affair. Linda kept talking about how busy they all were, as if their schedules were more important than anyone else's. At one point, Roger actually said, "Well, you know, it's a good thing we're here to help out when we can. Mom and Dad need us." I almost choked on my food. Help out? When? In between his golf games and Chloe's dance recitals? But the real slap in the face came after dinner. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I overheard Roger and Linda talking in the living room. They were whispering, but I caught bits and pieces. Something about the will and making sure everything's taken care of. My stomach dropped. I couldn't hear everything, but the way they were talking, it didn't sit right with me. I've never cared about money, and I know my grandparents don't have a fortune or anything. But the idea of Roger and Linda plotting behind their backs made my blood boil. Walter's been so forgetful lately, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Roger might try to take advantage of that. After they left, I tried to let it go. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I'd misheard. But then, a few days later, Logan and Chloe stopped by out of the blue. They've never visited on their own before, so it was weird right off the bat. Logan kept asking Walter all these weird questions, like, "How much do you think the house is worth? And do you have a safe somewhere for important stuff?" Chloe, meanwhile, was sweet-talking Evelyn, asking about old family heirlooms and jewelry. By the time they left, I felt sick. Something was definitely going on, but I didn't know what to do about it. Evelyn and Walter are so trusting, and I didn't want to upset them. But I couldn't just sit back and do nothing either. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying everything in my head. The whispers about the will, Logan's questions, Chloe's fake charm. It all added up to something shady. I decided I needed to keep an eye on things, to protect Evelyn and Walter in case Roger and his family tried anything. I just didn't realize how far they'd go. What do I do? Okay, so after Logan and Chloe's surprise visit, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just their behavior. It was the way they'd both been so deliberate. Logan wasn't casually curious about the house. He was practically drilling Walter for information. And Chloe? I swear she was eyeing Evelyn's jewelry box like it had a neon, free money sign above it. I didn't have any concrete proof, but my gut was screaming at me that something shady was happening. The thing is, I didn't know where to start. My grandparents are simple, straightforward people. They don't have secret safes full of cash or offshore accounts or anything like that. Most of their money is tied up in the house and a modest retirement fund. Evelyn's made it clear over the years that they want the house to stay in the family after they're gone. She's sentimental like that. Walter's always agreed, though he's been less vocal about it lately, probably because he struggles to keep up with conversations sometimes. Anyway, the more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed to dig deeper. One day, when Evelyn asked me to help her clean out the old filing cabinet in their spare bedroom, I saw an opportunity. The cabinet was crammed with decades of paperwork. Utility bills from the 90s, old car insurance policies, even Walter's pay stubs from his first job. Evelyn handed me a stack of papers and told me to shred whatever wasn't important anymore. I was halfway through the stack when I found something that made me freeze. It was a draft of Walter's will, dated 5 years ago. I'm no legal expert, but the language was pretty clear. It left everything, the house, their savings, even the old Buick in the garage, to be split equally between my mom and Roger. That seemed fair enough. But as I shuffled through the papers, I found another document, this one dated last year. It was a new draft of the will, and the changes were significant. In this version, Roger was listed as the executor of the estate, and his share had been bumped up to 75%. My mom's share had been reduced to 25%, with a note saying something about consideration for prior financial support. There was no mention of me or my cousins, which didn't surprise me, but the shift in percentages? That definitely did. The worst part? The signature at the bottom of the document didn't look right. I'd seen Walter's signature plenty of times, on birthday cards, Christmas checks, even the crossword puzzles he used to sign when he finished them. This signature was shaky and uneven, like someone had tried to copy it. My heart was pounding as I showed the document to Evelyn, but she just waved it off. "Oh, that's nothing," she said. Walter's memory's been a little fuzzy, so Roger offered to help him update the will. "I'm sure it's fine." Fine? It was anything but fine. I didn't say that, though. I didn't want to upset her. Instead, I told her I'd hold onto the document for safekeeping, and she didn't seem to mind. But inside, I was fuming. Roger was clearly up to something, and he was using Walter's memory issues to his advantage. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention whenever Roger or his family came around. They were careful, I'll give them that, but little things started to slip. One day, I caught Logan snooping around Walter's desk, and when I asked what he was doing, he just shrugged and said, "Looking for a pin?" Another time, I overheard Chloe asking Evelyn about her jewelry collection again, saying something like, "You should make a list of everything, Grandma, just in case." The final straw came when I found a stack of blank papers on Walter's desk, all with his shaky signature at the bottom. I don't know if Roger had pressured him into practicing his signature or if he just forged it outright, but either way, it felt like proof that something shady was happening. I knew I couldn't handle this on my own anymore. I needed help, but who could I trust? My mom would have been my first choice, but she was swamped with work and barely had time to visit her parents, let alone deal with a potential inheritance scam. Evelyn and Walter were too trusting to believe Roger would ever do something like this. That left one option: hiring a professional. I didn't know much about private investigators, so I did what any millennial would do. I Googled it. After scrolling through a bunch of sketchy-looking websites, I found one that seemed legit. The guy's name was Caleb, and his specialty was inheritance disputes and financial fraud. His website was full of testimonials from people who claimed he'd helped them expose shady family members and protect their loved ones' estates. It sounded like exactly what I needed. I called him the next day. Caleb's voice was calm and reassuring, but he didn't sugarcoat things. "These situations can get ugly," he said. "Family disputes over money bring out the worst in people. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" I didn't even hesitate. "I'm sure," I said. "I need to protect my grandparents." Caleb agreed to take the case, and we set up a time for him to come over and meet Evelyn and Walter. I didn't tell them he was a private investigator. I just said he was an old friend who wanted to catch up. They were thrilled to have company, as always, and Caleb did a great job of blending in. He asked a few casual questions about their finances and family history, but nothing that raised any red flags. Afterward, Caleb pulled me aside and said he'd start digging into Roger's financial records. He warned me that it might take a while, but he seemed confident he'd find something. In the meantime, I kept a close eye on Roger and his family. They were visiting more often now, always under the guise of helping out. Linda started bringing over casseroles, which Evelyn loved, but I couldn't help noticing that she always left the house with more than she came in with. Whether it was old photo albums, pieces of furniture, or even a couple of Walter's tools from the garage, the whole thing was making me paranoid. Every time I saw Roger, I felt like he was watching me, like he knew I was onto him. One night, I caught him staring at me across the dinner table, his expression unreadable. I don't know why, but it sent a chill down my spine. I knew I had to stay focused. If Caleb found what I suspected he would, I'd finally have the proof I needed to stop Roger from taking advantage of Evelyn and Walter. But until then, all I could do was wait and hope that I wasn't already too late. Things started moving quickly after Caleb agreed to take on the case. It wasn't cheap, but I didn't care. This wasn't about money for me. It was about protecting my grandparents from being exploited by their own son. I don't know how Caleb did it, but he managed to pull together a full background check on Roger within just a few days. What he found only made my gut feelings seem more justified. Roger and Linda were drowning in debt. I'm talking maxed out credit cards, overdue mortgage payments, and a few sketchy business loans that had gone unpaid for years. Apparently, Roger had tried his hand at some investment schemes a while back, flipping houses, starting a landscaping business, even a failed cryptocurrency project. All of it had crashed and burned, leaving him scrambling to cover his losses. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. Roger wasn't visiting Evelyn and Walter out of the kindness of his heart. He was trying to dig himself out of a financial hole. And he wasn't just desperate, he was dangerous. Caleb also found a few red flags about Linda. She wasn't as flashy as Roger when it came to her failures, but her spending habits told their own story. Designer handbags, jewelry, high-end vacations, all charged to credit cards that were now months overdue. On paper, Roger and Linda looked like they were living the American dream. In reality, they were one paycheck away from bankruptcy. The most disturbing part? Caleb discovered that Roger had recently consulted with an estate lawyer. The lawyer specialized in elder law and had a reputation for bending the rules to accommodate creative inheritance plans. Caleb couldn't confirm what they discussed, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. It was clear Roger was preparing for something, and I wasn't about to let him get away with it. I'll admit, knowing all of this didn't make things easier for me. If anything, it made me more paranoid. Every time Roger came over, I felt like I was walking on eggshells, trying to act normal while secretly seething inside. It didn't help that he was laying it on thick, too, offering to bring groceries, asking Walter if he needed anything fixed around the house, even suggesting that Evelyn should rest more and let him take care of things. Family takes care of family, he'd say, with this smug little grin that made me want to punch him. Logan and Chloe were just as bad. Logan started showing up at random times, offering to help Walter with projects in the garage. The kid had never worked a day in his life, but now he was suddenly interested in fixing old lawnmowers. Please. And Chloe? She started buttering up Evelyn even more, complimenting her on everything from her cooking to her graceful aging. It was so transparent, I couldn't believe Evelyn was falling for it. But Walter? He wasn't falling for anything. At least, not when he was having one of his good days. I don't trust Roger, he told me one afternoon, while we were sitting on the porch. It was one of those rare moments when he seemed sharp and focused, like his old self. He's up to something. I can feel it. Hearing that gave me a glimmer of hope. If Walter still had enough clarity to be suspicious of Roger, maybe there was still time to stop whatever he was planning. Meanwhile, Caleb was making progress. He started digging into the new draft of the will that I'd found in the filing cabinet. As it turned out, it hadn't been officially filed yet, which was a huge relief. But Caleb pointed out something even more concerning. There were two other drafts of the will that I hadn't seen. One of them, dated a few months ago, named Roger as the sole beneficiary. The other, dated just last week, named Logan and Chloe as co-beneficiaries, with Roger listed as the executor. Both of them were signed with Walter's shaky signature. That's not just suspicious, Caleb told me when we met to go over his findings. That's blatant fraud. Either your grandfather doesn't remember signing these, or someone forged his signature. Either way, it's illegal. I felt a mix of anger and relief. Anger, because Roger was clearly trying to steal everything from my grandparents. Relief, because now I had proof. I wasn't just imagining things. This was real, and I was finally in a position to do something about it. But here's the thing. Confronting Roger wasn't going to be easy. Caleb warned me that people like him, people who are desperate and cornered, tend to lash out when their schemes are exposed. He told me to be careful, to document everything, and to avoid direct confrontations until we had enough evidence to take legal action. That's when I decided to take things a step further. One evening, while Roger and Linda were over for dinner, I excused myself and snuck out to their car. I know, It sounds crazy, but hear me out. I'd noticed Roger acting suspicious earlier that day, taking Walter aside and whispering something to him in the living room. I had a feeling he was up to something, and I wanted to know what. Their car was unlocked, rookie mistake, and I found exactly what I was looking for. A folder full of legal documents. Most of it was generic stuff, tax returns, property deeds, things like that. But tucked inside was a letter from Roger's estate lawyer, outlining steps to secure assets and streamline inheritance proceedings. It even mentioned caregiver influence, which I assumed was a thinly veiled jab at me. I snapped photos of everything and got out of there before anyone noticed. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't stop smiling. This was it. This was the evidence I needed to prove Roger's intentions. The next day, I gave the photos to Caleb, and he said they were the smoking gun he'd been waiting for. He promised to compile everything into a report that I could use if this ever went to court. In the meantime, he suggested that I start preparing Evelyn and Walter for the possibility of cutting ties with Roger altogether. That was easier said than done. Evelyn adored Roger, no matter how obvious his flaws were. She always found a way to defend him, even when he didn't deserve it. Walter, on the other hand, was more skeptical. But with his memory issues, it was hard to know how much of this he'd actually remember if I tried to explain it to him. Still, I knew I couldn't wait much longer. Roger's visits were becoming more frequent, and his behavior was becoming more brazen. One evening, I overheard him telling Evelyn that she should consider signing over power of attorney to him, just in case something happened to Walter. That was it. I couldn't stay quiet any longer. Why would she do that? I asked, stepping into the room. My voice was calm, but inside, I was furious. Roger froze, his face going pale. It's just a precaution, he said, flashing that fake smile of his. You know, to make things easier for Mom and Dad. But I wasn't buying it anymore. I think you've done enough, Roger, I said, staring him down. Why don't you let me handle things from here? The tension in the room was unbearable. Evelyn looked confused, Walter looked lost, and Roger looked like he wanted to kill me. It was only a matter of time before everything blew up. Have you ever had to stand up to a family member to protect someone you care about? How did it go? All right, this is where things went completely off the rails. Up until this point, I've been trying to play it cool, to keep everything low-key while I gathered evidence. But after Roger's little stunt about the power of attorney, I realized I couldn't wait any longer. It was time to expose him. The day after that confrontation, Caleb sent me an email with everything he'd compiled. The fraudulent will drafts, the financial records showing Roger and Linda's debt, and the photos I'd taken of the lawyer's inheritance plan. It was a mountain of evidence, and honestly, it felt like a relief to finally have it all laid out in front of me. But now came the hard part, showing Evelyn and Walter the truth. I knew it wasn't going to be easy. Evelyn was the type of person who always wanted to see the best in people, especially her own children. She still talked about Roger like he was the golden boy, even though he'd been a screw-up for most of his adult life. And Walter, well, on his good days, he might understand what was happening. But on his bad days, he'd probably just nod along and forget about it 5 minutes later. I couldn't count on him to back me up. So, I decided to approach Evelyn first. I waited until we were alone in the kitchen, just the two of us, and I started with something small. Grandma, I said, keeping my tone casual, can I ask you something? Do you trust Roger? She looked up from the pie she was baking, her face wrinkling with confusion. Of course I do, she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. He's my son, but do you trust him with everything? I pressed. Like, the house, the money, all that? She paused for a moment, her hands still dusted with flour. Jordan, what's this about? I hesitated. Part of me wanted to sugarcoat it, to ease her into the truth. But the other part of me, the part that was sick of Roger and his lies, knew there wasn't time for that. I think Roger's trying to take advantage of you and Grandpa, I said, finally. I've been watching him and I've found some things, some proof, that he's not being honest with you. Her face fell. Jordan, that's a serious accusation. I know it is, I said, pulling out my phone. But I need you to look at this. I opened the folder of photos Caleb had sent me, showing her the fake will drafts, the lawyer's letter, and the financial records. As she scrolled through them, her hands started to tremble. I don't understand, she murmured. Roger would never. He would, I said gently. And he is. He's been forging Grandpa's signature, trying to change the will so he gets everything. He's even been talking to lawyers about taking control of your finances. Grandma, you have to believe me. Evelyn looked up at me, her eyes filling with tears. How could he do this? she whispered. To his own family? I didn't have an answer for her. All I could do was sit there while she tried to process everything. Eventually, she nodded and said, we need to show this to Walter. He has a right to know. That part went about as well as I'd expected. Walter was having a good day, thankfully, so he was able to follow along as I explained everything. But his reaction wasn't what I'd hoped for. Instead of getting angry or upset, he just looked defeated. I always knew Roger cared more about money than family, he said quietly. But I never thought he'd go this far. Evelyn started crying again, and I felt like I was about to lose it too. But I couldn't afford to break down. Not yet. We have to do something, I said. We can't let him get away with this. Walter nodded slowly. You're right, he said. It's time we set things straight. That weekend, Evelyn and Walter invited Roger and Linda over for a family meeting. I didn't tell them why. I wanted them to walk into this blind. I didn't want to give them a chance to come up with excuses or cover their tracks. When they arrived, I could tell something was off. Roger seemed tense, like he knew something was up, but he tried to play it cool. Linda, on the other hand, was all fake smiles and compliments, gushing about how nice the house looked. Logan and Chloe weren't there, thankfully, which made things a little less chaotic. Once everyone was seated in the living room, Walter cleared his throat and said, we need to talk. Roger leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. About what? About this, I said, stepping forward and placing the folder of evidence on the coffee table. Go ahead, take a look. Roger hesitated, glancing at Linda, before reaching for the folder. As he flipped through the pages, his face went pale. By the time he got to the fake will drafts, he was sweating. What is this? He stammered. You tell us, Walter said, his voice surprisingly firm. Because it looks like you've been trying to steal from us. Dad, come on, Roger said, forcing a laugh. This is ridiculous. I don't know where you got this, but it's obviously fake. Fake, I said, raising an eyebrow. Because we have a private investigator who says otherwise. And if you want to keep playing dumb, we can take this to court and let a judge decide. That wiped the smirk off his face. Jordan, Linda said, trying to sound calm. You don't understand. Roger's just been trying to help. Your grandparents are getting older, and we wanted to make sure everything was taken care of. That's all. By forging Grandpa's signature? I shot back. By cutting my mom out of the will? By scheming behind their backs? Roger slammed the folder shut and stood up, his face red. You don't know what you're talking about, he snapped. This is none of your business. None of my business? I said, stepping closer. You're messing with my grandparents' lives, their home, their future. Of course it's my business. Evelyn stood up too, her voice trembling with anger. Roger, how could you? After everything we've done for you? We trusted you. Roger opened his mouth to respond, but for once, he didn't have anything to say. He just stood there, glaring at me like this was all my fault. Finally, Walter spoke up. Get out, he said. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the finality in his tone. And don't come back. Dad, you don't mean that. I do, Walter interrupted. I'm done with you, Roger. You've crossed a line, and there's no coming back from this. Roger looked like he wanted to argue, but he must have realized it was pointless. He grabbed the folder, shoved it back toward me, and stormed out of the house, with Linda trailing behind him. As soon as the doors slammed shut, Evelyn broke down in tears. I wrapped my arms around her, promising her that everything would be okay. But deep down, I couldn't help wondering if Roger was really gone for good. After Roger and Linda stormed out of the house, the silence that followed was almost worse than the confrontation itself. Evelyn was still crying softly, sitting on the couch with her face in her hands. Walter, meanwhile, just stared at the door like he couldn't believe what had just happened. As for me, I felt like I'd run a marathon. My hands were shaking and my chest was tight, but there was a sense of relief bubbling up under all the tension. It was over, or so I thought. For the next few days, the house felt heavier than usual. Evelyn and Walter were struggling to process everything, and honestly, so was I. Walter didn't talk about it much, but when he did, his voice carried this deep sadness, like he couldn't quite accept that his own son would betray him like that. Evelyn, on the other hand, swung between heartbreak and anger. One minute, she'd be reminiscing about Roger's childhood, wondering where she went wrong. The next, she'd be muttering about how she never wanted to see him again. I tried to be there for them as much as I could, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't weigh on me. It felt like the family I'd known my whole life was falling apart. My mom, Diane, called me when she found out what had happened. Apparently, Roger had told her his side of the story, which, unsurprisingly, painted him as the victim. "You really blindsided him, Jordan," she said, sounding almost accusatory. "He says you humiliated him in front of Mom and Dad. Did he also tell you about the fake wills he forged? Or the lawyer he hired to steal everything from Grandma and Grandpa?" I shot back. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before she sighed. I can't believe it's come to this. He's my brother, Jordan, and he's their son," I said. But that didn't stop him from trying to screw them over. "If you don't believe me, I can send you all the evidence we found." Diane didn't say much after that, but I could tell she didn't want to fully accept the truth either. Part of me understood. It's hard to admit that someone you love is capable of something so awful. But another part of me was furious. It wasn't like Roger had made a mistake or acted out of desperation. He'd planned this for months, if not longer. A week later, Caleb called me with an update. He'd been keeping an eye on Roger and Linda's financial situation, just in case they tried to retaliate. Apparently, Roger's lawyer had dropped him as a client after finding out about the forgery accusations. On top of that, one of the banks they owed money to had started the foreclosure process on their house. "They're in a bad spot," Caleb told me. "I don't think they'll come after your grandparents again. At least, not anytime soon. But if they do, you've got more than enough evidence to shut it down." That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. Knowing Roger was finally facing consequences for his actions didn't erase the damage he'd done to our family. And it didn't make up for the fact that Evelyn and Walter had lost their trust in their own son. Still, I tried to focus on moving forward. Evelyn and Walter decided to rewrite their will, for real this time, with no input from Roger. They even added a clause to protect their assets from being contested after they were gone. Caleb recommended a lawyer who specialized in elder law, someone he trusted to handle things honestly. I went with them to the appointment, partly to make sure everything went smoothly and partly because I didn't want them to feel alone. Watching them sign the new documents was bittersweet. On one hand, it was a huge relief to know their wishes were finally protected. On the other hand, it was a reminder of everything we'd been through to get to that point. As for Roger and his family, they disappeared from our lives almost overnight. No more surprise visits, no more awkward dinners, no more fake concern. At first, Evelyn was devastated. She kept asking if I thought Roger would ever come around, if there was any way to fix things. But as time went on, she started to accept that some wounds don't heal. Walter, on the other hand, seemed more at peace. One afternoon, while we were sitting on the porch, he turned to me and said, "You did the right thing, Jordan. It wasn't easy, but you did what needed to be done. I'm proud of you for that." Hearing that meant more to me than I can put into words. For so long, I'd felt like I was fighting this battle on my own. Like no one else saw what I saw or understood why I was so determined to protect Evelyn and Walter. Knowing that Walter appreciated what I'd done made all of it feel worth it. Over time, things started to settle down. Evelyn and Walter fell back into their routine, and I kept helping out whenever they needed me. But the whole ordeal left a mark on all of us. It's hard to look at your family the same way after something like that. One day, out of the blue, Logan called me. I hadn't heard from him since the blow-up with Roger, so I was surprised when his name popped up on my phone. "Hey," he said awkwardly when I answered. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For, everything." I wasn't sure how to respond. Logan had been complicit in Roger's schemes, but he was also just a kid, barely 20, still living under his parents' roof. Part of me wanted to tell him to go to hell, but another part of me wondered if this was his way of breaking away from Roger's influence. "I appreciate that," I said finally. "But an apology doesn't fix what happened." "I know," he said. I didn't know how bad it was, My dad kept telling us it was no big deal, that he was just trying to help Grandma and Grandpa. I didn't realize." His voice trailed off, and for a moment, I thought he was going to cry. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "If you really mean that, then prove it. Be better than him. Take care of your grandparents, even if he won't." Logan didn't say anything for a long time, but eventually he muttered, "Yeah, okay." Then he hung up. I don't know if he'll actually change, but I'd like to think he will. If nothing else, maybe this whole mess taught him a lesson about integrity, something Roger clearly never learned. Now, months later, things are finally starting to feel normal again. Evelyn and Walter are doing well, and I'm still helping out whenever they need me. My mom visits more often now, which has been good for all of us. And Roger? He's still out there somewhere, but I don't spend much time thinking about him anymore. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that family isn't just about blood. It's about trust, respect, and showing up when it matters. Roger may have broken that trust, but I'm not going to let his actions define the rest of us. And would you have gone as far as hiring a private investigator to expose someone in your family? Or do you think there's a better way to handle situations like this? Do you believe it's possible to rebuild trust with someone who has betrayed their family so deeply?